The following talk is offered freely to ensure that no one is ever denied access to these practices and to these teachings. If you feel inspired to make a donation to support this offering, you can go to my website at jonathanfoust.com. While you're there, you can also sign up for a monthly newsletter designed to support you in your practice. Thank you, and enjoy.
When I was in grad school, I was reading a book called Grist for the Mill by Ram Dass, or this Richard Alpert guy. And I was enthralled by the book. Everything I was reading just seemed like truths. As if he was writing things that I kind of already knew, but it was just sort of turning on the lights inside a little bit. And I remember so clearly, it was one of those moments. I remember I was lying in bed and reading this book, and then it was one of those thoughts like, this is true. I just thought, I am not going to live a conventional life. And I doubled down on my meditation practice. I ended a relationship. I moved to New Mexico. I sold my car. I bought a motorcycle, and my life has been an amazing adventure. In many ways, very, very blessed, and in many ways inspired by this teacher of Ram Dass. Ram Dass died about 6 weeks ago, and he certainly lived a very unconventional life. He was, for many of us, kind of the icebreaker that made it possible for so many people in the West to really explore the spiritual life. He lived his life, what he was really called to do. And I had a conversation this weekend with my kind of ashram brother and Dharma buddy, Matt Ostreicher, who spent a good number of months on Maui with Ram Dass. People would sort of volunteer after his stroke to support him, so he was there for quite a few months and helping him in all kinds of ways. And Matt put it really well. If you're not familiar with Ram Dass, he said he was really the consummate explainer. He had this very, very deep drive in his life. And the first drive really showed up as material ambition. You know, he was, I'll talk about it in a little bit. But then he had a very profound awakening, and his drive became more spiritual. And he had a certain gravitas. You know, he was a Harvard professor and came from wealth and had a very, very well-refined intellect. So when he turned from the material and kind of moved toward spiritual inquiry, the timing was so ripe in our culture at that time. And he taught from the inside out and influenced countless people. I know many people in this room have been touched by him. Some people really kind of gave him kind of a guru status. You know, he was so eloquent that many people assumed that he was realizing everything he was writing. And what was so charming about him was that he really chose to be transparent in his teachings, not to hide anything. So there's a certain humanity about him that really inspired me in my life. And I've had so many flashes of over the years of little things he said that kind of influenced me in some way. And as I was just in looking out, I remember he told this one example of the different planes of how we interact. You know, if you look through the chakras, the 7 energy centers, and you go into a room full of people, you know, on one level, at the very basic level, you're primarily concerned with survival. You know, am I going to be safe here? You know, and then kind of the next level is sort of the level of kind of like procreation and sexuality. Like, wow, is there anyone here I might mate with? There's that level of like who's attractive. And the next level, sort of level of power. Like, oh, who's got the power in the room here? Who's dominating? How do I avoid domination? Who could I dominate? The next level is sort of the level of the heart, where you begin to sense there's an interconnectivity here. And the next level is the sense of really sensing kind of a quality of presence, a quality of spirituality that we share. And then the next level is sort of this level of where we're in a place where we're simply loving presence, where we're already fully awake and fully present here. And I think that's one of the beautiful things of just having a gathering like this, is we're here at all different levels of our humanity, from our fears and anxieties and our concerns about life, and yet there's something we share, which is this quality of loving awareness, where we're already awake, we're already present. There's really nothing to learn. We're just sharing the moment together. So I'd like to talk a little bit about his call to awakening, and a little bit about the formation of his path, which was unique and influential in our culture, and then a little bit on some of the expression of his insight, and some of his more potent teachings. So he was born Richard Alpert in Boston, if you're not familiar with his biography, from a wealthy family. Had a lot of wealth and a lot of privilege. Was very bright. He went to Stanford, got his PhD. Was on a tenure track at Harvard, and he was very much in the aspiring materialist phase of his life. At one time, he had a Mercedes-Benz, an apartment filled with antiques, a Cessna airplane, a Triumph motorcycle, a sailboat, an MG sports car, and took like diving trips to the Caribbean. Living the full material life. Harvard professor, got it all together. And his initial call was around prestige and around influence, and he was a cultural influencer, for sure. But it's interesting how life happens. I think we all at different points in our life sense some essential dissatisfaction. Some sense that there has to be more to this life than what I'm living right now. And he was certainly feeling that as well. And at that time, at Harvard, one of the fellow professors he befriended was Timothy Leary. If you're familiar with Andrew Weil, the doctor, he was also at Harvard at that time. He was part of the Harvard Psychedelic Club. And there was some really interesting research going on. There were two particular drugs that looked very promising. They were legal in 1960. So between 1960 and 1962, the first one is lysergic acid, how do you pronounce it? LSD, and psilocybin, the active agent in mushrooms. And so at that time, as he talked about this time in his life, he had all this wealth, all this material accomplishment, but also a very deep dread. In academia, it's publish or perish. You have to come up with the next thing, and that's what's going to keep you going. And as soon as you have that, you need the next thing. And so he felt this sense of emptiness inside, the imposter syndrome that so many of us carry. And so Timothy Leary gave him some LSD, And he describes that experience as he described it as sort of seeing himself from the outside, and he saw himself as this therapist. And he said, well, that's not me. And then he saw himself as a professor, and he thought, well, that's not me either. And he saw himself as the socialite. That's not me either. And it began this sense of panic and sort of losing his identity. Well, who am I? And with that was kind of dread, but also a very kind of euphoric feeling began to arise. And he had this moment he described where Timothy Leary's house was just a few blocks from his parents' house in Cambridge. And it was in the middle of a snowstorm. So he went over to his parents' house to shovel the snow. And he had this moment of shoveling snow where he became so absorbed in this shoveling the snow. It was like one of the first moments in his life when he thought, I'm doing something without any expectation of anything, getting anything at the end of this. Which is kind of what we can describe as mindfulness. You know, when you're walking and you're simply walking, there's no goal, you're simply fully present. And that was his first really, really deep taste of mindfulness, of what it means to be like fully present. With that sort of shattering of his sense of self and seeing these sort of roles that he was playing in life, but not being able to see which one was really him, he went back to teach. His next class was on the development of ego psychology. And he thought, I can't go back to this. Because I just don't know what's true anymore. So that shattering of his sense of ego was a very profound starting point for him. And it really excited his interest in this research, not just the research, but the experience from doing the research. And so in the early 60s, 1960 to 1962, they started doing, you could say, very freewheeling research, where they were basically just handing out psilocybin and LSD to anyone who's slightly interested and giving a little paper questionnaire for them to fill out. And so they were just turning on everyone on campus. Not a whole lot of screening going on. And so he and Timothy Leary and Andrew Weil and all these others, and I have another good friend from the ashram who's part of that crowd. It was just, how far can we push this exploration into consciousness? So one of the things you simply can't do when you're a professor doing research is to participate in the research with the people you're researching. And so that got him kicked out. So they were kicked out of Harvard at that time. But they really felt like they were on to something that was going to change the world. There was a tremendous sense of excitement at that time. And he has some great stories. You know, he tells us one story of doing LSD and having his whole adventure, and then realizing he got the answer to everything. He just got it. And he crawled over to his nightstand and he wrote what it was. And then, his adventure went on. And later, as he kind of, woke up the next morning, he thought, oh my God, I had the answer. I know I had the answer. And so he went over to his nightstand and scrawled in these really big letters with the words, just be. Now, there's so many stories about these chemicals that they were using, and there was a really true sense, and these are very, very bright people, a real sense of the impact that this could have shifting our culture. And I wanted to step back a little bit and say a little bit about that. part of kind of the downfall of Timothy Leary was that he just felt that this should be like everyone in the world should have the experience in order to fully wake up, and a little bit out of control. And as you can imagine, it alarmed a lot of people. And as so many people got turned on to using these substances, it created this real clampdown from the legal perspective. And suddenly these expansive drugs were illegal and hard to find. Everything went underground, et cetera, et cetera. And what's so interesting now is there's now a resurgence of research in terms of what happens, what can happen in consciousness through the chemical research, if you will. There's a lot of research happening up the road here at Johns Hopkins of exploring the effect of high-dose psilocybin on those with terminal illness, a separate one on those with severe addiction, and then a third on the effect of high-dose psilocybin on long-term meditators. I referred some people to them. One person in particular had a terminal illness, and I just love this guy. He's from Wisconsin, grew up on a dairy farm, kind of an Eagle Scout kind of person, and had a condition, was referred to him, and I talked to him later. And of course, he had done nothing psychotropic. And I asked him, how was it? And he just got this look in his eyes. He said it was the most beautiful experience of my life, like a mountaintop experience. I helped them a little bit with the protocol for their study on long-term meditators and went through the protocol as well. And now there's a fresh wave of money coming in exploring the effects here. Another set of research happening now is on MDMA, which is very, very interesting. If I understand correctly, MDMA was created in Germany, and it was used as for men with shell shock or PTSD to help them communicate with their spouses. And MDMA for many, many years, when it was illegal in the States, was used as a therapeutic drug because it has a very, very powerful way of kind of softening the boundaries around the heart and making it possible for people to communicate. But now we're finding that it's one of the most effective ways of working with PTSD and working with depression. So my view is that just as a knife in the hands of a surgeon can save someone's life, or the knife in the hand of someone who is having a psychic break can kill someone, these substances can be extraordinary. I had my first psychotropic experience when I was 15, and it absolutely opened my eyes. And I feel so lucky in that about 10 days later I learned meditation and was able to kind of find a more organic path. And it's interesting how as Ram Dass was exploring, he found himself getting more and more frustrated because he would go to being fully awake and then he would come down and be fully human. And it became simply trying to get back to where he was. And so it became very much an expression of our human experience, is we're on our way somewhere. There's someplace we want to be, and it's not here. And so as they took it to the limit, he began to recognize that it really wasn't working for him. It was actually reinforcing a very, very deep hunger in him. And he wasn't being satisfied through these temporary, powerful experiences. He said, the only problem with getting high is I keep coming down. And so he traveled to India, and he met this wild-eyed zealot from the United States by the name of Bhagavan Das. who's quite a character, still alive. And he spoke beautifully of his guru, Neem Karoli Baba. And when Richard Alpert, who was Richard then, when he met Neem Karoli Baba, he said this. He said, I remember my first visit with my guru. He'd shown that he read my mind. So I looked at the grass and I thought, my God, he's going to know all the things we don't want people to know. I was really embarrassed. Then I looked up and he was looking directly at me with unconditional love. And he tells the story of how at that time he was driving a Land Rover. He had a really kind of a fancy Land Rover, and when he met his guru, and he was really drawn to this really radiant teacher, and the guru said, "Will you give me your car?" And he instantly had this like recoil. I'm like, no. And he realized that he wasn't willing to surrender. and the guru gave him this big smile, and he just said, "Yeah, you're not ready, are you?" So when he came back from India, he came back really transformed. And this is where one of his most famous things when he said, we're not here to get high, we're here to get free. And this internal shift was quite powerful. And in many ways, as he began to articulate his experience, it opened up a real doorway. And it was, to my mind, a very profound shift in our culture, and one that I personally experienced, as well as many, many people I know. When he spoke of yoga and yoga philosophy, and he spoke of his relationship with his guru, it kind of opened the door for a lot of interest in yoga at that time. And I was one of those early people who, moved into an ashram, and my wife moved into a different ashram. And the one thing we really brought was this sense of idealism, a really profound idealism. This real sense of what's possible, and in many ways informed by people like Ram Dass, who explained it so powerfully. But a little word about gurus as well. Just as certain chemicals can help us see clearly for a few moments, certain gurus can do the same. But just as chemicals are not necessarily the answer, gurus may not necessarily be the answer either. Ram Dass had so many beautiful stories of his guru, and I think it fed this idealism in our culture of, wow, there must be these perfected beings out there who can help us become more awake. So a lot of teachers came to the West, and a lot of ashrams were established, and they became really quite powerful. There were some really, really large ashrams. The one that I was very much a part of, at one point we had 300 people in our community living together. And it was an extraordinary experience. I wouldn't trade it for anything. And yet in that idealism there was a shadow. Most all of those large ashrams are no longer large ashrams. I think one thing we forgot was when we're looking for a teacher, what we're really looking for is the inner teacher. And in many of these cases, particularly where there is so much devotion, many of these teachers kind of fell prey to a tremendous amount of power and weren't able to handle it. And Ram Dass spoke of that as well, that so many people would ascribe him with all these powers that he didn't necessarily felt he had, but he could feel himself getting inflated by it. And he worked hard to try to not get too inflated by that. So that whole movement of yoga in the West was just a phenomenal ride, really phenomenal ride. And, my whole kind of like, and again, I feel like I was sort of like riding after the icebreaker of these early pioneers like Ram Dass and others. And while there was so much idealism, so many talented, gifted people who really were working hard to transform themselves and transform the world, there was also a little bit of a cult/culture, that occurred. There was, in many ways, kind of a mindless devotion to the teacher. But one of the most powerful lessons that Ram Dass brought back was not only this deep desire to wake up, but waking up through the path of service. One thing he promised his guru is that he would serve. He created the Seva Foundation, which brought these very, very simple eye operations to people in the third world who otherwise wouldn't have access to healthcare. And he spoke a lot about service as a path of transformation. And just here are some words from him. He said, "You find the light within you. You don't find it in politics. The soul is composed of compassion, wisdom, peace, and joy. And those are in us. We have our attention on all the outside things, but we haven't taken the time to look inside. When we look inside and reflect our soul, we radiate love. We radiate compassion. We radiate the things that the world needs at this point. All we have to do is be our being and convince others to look inside. Then we have a group that can counteract the darkness." So there are different paths to union or yoga. Classically, there's the path of what's called bhakti yoga, which is just the path of devotion, where you just open your heart. Another path is the path of karma yoga, the path of action, of selfless service. Another path is the path of Raja Yoga, which is consciously purifying the body, purifying the mind, to get more and more clear. And another path is Jnana Yoga, which is using the mind to go beyond the mind. And Ram Dass spoke, and he really had a beautiful way of bridging all of them, but he really spoke a lot about karma yoga and bhakti yoga, the devotion and service and how they went together. And he talked a lot about how if you take on service as a vehicle for transformation, how it becomes a very powerful mirror for you. And he talks about, in this quote, the word seva, which means selfless service. He said, "I'm trying to understand what real karma yoga is all about, what selfless service is all about. And that is the service which is rooted in devotional yoga. Is the service where you are the breath of God, where you are serving out of the collective, compassionate heart, where it isn't me doing it for you, it's that I have surrendered into the force of the universe which heals, and I'm just part of the healing." I was really struck by that quote, and on Friday night, a friend who lives somewhat near me, her dog ran off in the middle of the night into the park, and it was around 9 p.m. And I had a dog that had once run off at 9 p.m. and didn't come back. It was hit by a car. And I immediately had this response of, "What do you need? Just tell me what you need and I'll be there." And it was really interesting after reading that quote and just having that experience of when when we feel suffering and we relate to that suffering, the response is so, it can be very, very pure. But he also talked about how easy it is to lose your center when you take on service as a path. He said this, he said, it's very easy to lose your center and forget that compassion for yourself is the source of compassion for others. It's essential to take time each day to quiet down and process the data of your life using techniques such as meditation, reading sacred texts, or working with mantras or malas. If you think you're somebody doing something, you're going to burn out. It's as simple as that. So he spoke beautifully of cultivating a purity as you respond to suffering. To notice if you're acting out of pity, to notice if you're acting out of some story where you're the do-gooder. If you have the sense of doing it as a self-improvement project, it doesn't have the purity of that path. And he talked about something. This was back in the 80s. I remember him speaking about this. And it really points to something really interesting, and that is that for many people who are caught in depression and who are caught in chronic pain, one of the most powerful things you can do is to help others. That when you make that step to helping others, it pulls you out of yourself in a really, really powerful way. And it's been lots of studies on that now. And just to corroborate that, he said, I invite you, when you are caught in your stuff and your heart is closed, to reach out to find someone who is suffering and to be there with them for a moment. What I find when my heart is closed is that the purity of their heart pulls me out of myself very quickly. For those who have been caught in individualism and separation, the act of serving another human being is a doorway back into your connection to the universe. Their real need pulls you out of yourself. So much of his teaching, if you're drawn to read any more of him, there's a podcast that's out now of many of his talks. He really taught as he was discovering his own life. And that was part of the beautiful thing, particularly as he got older. And he began to talk about getting older and sickness and old age and death. And he talked about when he had a stroke a good number of years ago. He had a very, very serious stroke. And he was terrified. And he was looking everywhere that he could get fixed. And then later he said, he thought to himself, he said, here I am, Mr. Spiritual. And when it happened, I didn't orient to the Spirit. It showed me I had some work to do because I flunked the test. And it's an interesting thing, because this sort of points to what all traditions speak to, is taking refuge. That when you are in those moments of feeling terrified and feeling lost, in what do you take refuge? And for him, as he began to resettle, and he thought again of his teacher and his love for his teacher, that became what calmed him. That became the refuge that he went to. And it becomes a very interesting question for each of us. Well, what is that place that you might go to if you were to experience something like that? He said, before the stroke, I was on a very spiritual plane, but I ignored my body. I took it for granted. When I look at my life, I see that I wanted to be free from the physical plane, the psychological plane. And when I got free of those, I didn't want to go anywhere near them. But the stroke reminded me that I had a body and a brain, and I had to honor them. So for this amazingly eloquent man to lose use of much of his body, and particularly to be afflicted with what's called expressive aphasia, which really means he couldn't speak, or it took him a very long time to speak, he was able to turn that into feeling it as a blessing. When you listen to him in his later years, he has long, long pauses before he would speak. He talked about how death is the biggest change that we have to face. And what he needs to practice is change. And so he took on his physical challenges as his practice. He had spent many, many years working in hospice. There is to be a bridge for people in their passing, and now it was his turn. One of the things I most loved about him is he once said, "Here I am at the end of my life. I did all kinds of chemical research. I guided people through chemical research. I did lots of meditation. I taught people meditation. I did lots of therapy, and I was a therapist. I've come to realize I'm as neurotic as I've ever been. But now I'm friends with them." And he talked of how, he said, the first part of death, the first stage of death, is frantically looking around saying, "Doctor, doctor, heal me, heal me." And the second phase is where you put the photos around your bed or on the wall and you wave goodbye to those photos and those images. And the next part, he said, is all about, wow, this is amazing. Oh my gosh, it's so beautiful. Our time has flown by. I think maybe what we'll do is we'll close with a little meditation. I'll share some of his readings on death. It might be an interesting way to close our evening. So as you close your eyes, as you reflect on this man's journey and let it resonate with your own journey. And some of these words that are part of his final words. I know that as souls we are unchangeable and beautiful, completely aware, and we continue no matter what. I learned that the soul is not located in my body. I know that when my body dies, awareness goes on. We have grown up in a materialistic society instead of cultivation of a quality of being. In the East, many people spend their lives preparing for aging and death. And it can be hard practice when you're older. Gandhi was uttering his mantras as he was shot. He was ready for what's next. Death often comes without warning, but we can begin to understand it by realizing the opposite of death isn't life. The opposite of death is birth. The beginning and the end are two sacred events, and in between, it's all impermanent. Life is arising and slipping away, each moment, each breath, but within us is awareness, unconditional and eternal. The ego asks, why not live for the moment? Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you will die. But if instead you live in the moment, being here now, discovering the preciousness of life in each moment, then you are not living as an ego, but as a soul outside time. The secret of dying is the secret of living, and this is to be in the present moment. At the moment of dying, if the pain is great and you are busy pushing it away, you'll be totally preoccupied with the pain or your fear of the unknown for yourself or your loved ones. It can be so great that you miss knowing the moment. All the preparation for dying is so that at the time of dying comes, you can say, like Aldous Huxley, "My goodness, look at that. Extraordinary. The body is going, and yet here we are." Every morning and every evening, I calm my heart by contemplating death. Then I'm able to live through my body, and I am free to live well. Each day for a few minutes, simply remember death. You can say to yourself, "All beings die. I will die too." Or you might remember loved ones who have died. Just find a way to bring death into awareness every day. So in these final moments, you might, in your own way, just sense the mystery of this life. Of this calling to know who you are. And one of the final chants in Ram Dass's life, he repeated these phrases: "I am loving awareness. I am loving awareness. I am living awareness." And as you're ready, you can deepen the breath. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. Thank you for your kind attention. I'll send some resources about Ram Dass if you'd like to check him out a little bit more. And there's nothing like following a reflection on death by having a cookie. So there's cookies and tea out there. Next week is a holiday. We won't be meeting, so I'll see you in 2 weeks. Have a great night.